In Isaiah's chapter 40 through 56, we find some of the most stunning prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures. The section is dubbed the servant section because of its many references to a figure that God calls my servant. I believe that Jesus of Nazareth very clearly fulfilled these servant passages, and no, I'm not primarily referring to Isaiah 53 in this video. But before we dive in, we should probably head off an objection up front. The servant is frequently identified with the nation of Israel as a whole, and those who are skeptical of Christianity argue that Isaiah can't possibly be referring to Jesus. But there are several passages where the servant is clearly differentiated from Israel as a nation. For example, Isaiah 49:5 reads, "And now the Lord said, who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him." So how exactly is the servant Israel if he is regathering Israel? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's also the famous suffering servant passage in Isaiah 53. Let's look at verse 8. Isaiah writes, "By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people." Okay, so how could Israel suffer innocently and also be stricken for Israel's sin at the same time? These verses become nonsensical if you apply them to the entire nation of Israel. There are more passages that we could look at, but I think you get the point. The most plausible explanation for this oddity has been suggested by many biblical scholars. Israel as a whole was called by God to do a specific task, but the work will be carried out by an individual Israelite. Now, it should be pointed out that some have suggested that the servant is a personification of Israel, perhaps a righteous remnant or an ideal Israel. I don't think that makes sense either. In Isaiah 53:3, the subject is called a man. A soul is ascribed to him in 53:11 through 12. Additionally, grave and death seem to imply a singular subject. If this was an allegory of a collective righteous remnant, we wouldn't expect these indicators. Okay, with those skeptical objections out of the way, let's talk about how Jesus is found in the text of Isaiah. I'm going to make somewhat of a bold claim here. There is no way that I'm going to be able to be accused of saying that the Gospels were writ to fit these predictions. Well, why is that? Well, that's because most of the fulfillments happen long after New Testament times. The writers of the New Testament couldn't conceivably have engineered these predictions. We'll be looking at Isaiah 49:6 through 7, which says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel and his Holy One, to one deeply despised, abhorred by the nation, the servant of rulers. Kings shall see and arise, princes, and they shall prostrate themselves because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you." The servant's role as a light to the Gentiles is explained here as bringing salvation to the ends of the earth. This suggests that the servant's work is to have a powerful global effect. Though despised and abhorred by the nation, even the rulers of the Gentiles will bow down to him. Can you think of any Israelites who fit these words apart from Jesus? Jesus is the only Jew who claimed to be the Messiah and founded a worldwide religion that includes billions of Gentiles, including kings and princes. He's the only Israelite who has had this kind of global influence. Now, before the beginning of the 1st century AD, monotheism was mostly practiced by Jews and a handful of Greek philosophers. The Hebrew scriptures were only known by a small part of the population. The vast majority of the known world was polytheistic. Their gods were not morally perfect either, far from it. Consequently, the Gentile world often displayed a very low set of moral standards. When the New Testament was written, the Jewish world had very restricted cultural, spiritual, and intellectual influence outside of its own communities. Throughout the Roman Empire, there were Jews, but they mostly kept to themselves. Many Jews refused to eat with non-Jews and made scant efforts to spread their faith, and very few Gentiles showed much interest in Judaism. Fast forward to today. Those who worship the God of Israel include Jews at 15.2 million and predominantly Gentile Christians at 2.4 billion. Islam at 1.9 billion may also be included since Christianity indirectly contributed to the rise of Islam. Since Jesus, about half the population now identifies with the God of Abraham. Overlooking Muslims and most Jews, about 1/3 of the population accepts Jesus as the Messiah. There is a presence of Christians on every continent and nearly every country. That includes Western countries and Eastern nations, poor nations and prosperous ones. Even in communist China, there's an estimated 44 million Christians. Clearly, Jesus of Nazareth has become a light to the nations as news of him has spread throughout the entire world. Jesus himself also predicted this would happen, saying, "This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations." So, what are the odds of this prophecy coming true? Approximately 1.9% of the world's population is Jewish. To be generous, let's say it was 2.8% back in Jesus' time. Based on 2.8%, the antecedent odds of becoming the world's largest religion emerging from this group are incredibly low. And how many famous Jews were also despised and abhorred by their nation, like we read about in Isaiah 49:7? Not a whole lot. The Jewish community, like most ethnic groups, tend to be proud of its members who have accomplished success in society. Jesus is viewed by the Jews as a religious innovator, and religious Jewish innovators are more likely to be despised more than non-religious innovators. Ironically, one of the standard objections made by skeptics of Christianity is that Jesus was rejected by the Jews. Additionally, the Christian church was persecuted until 313 AD as powerful rulers and officials attempted to suppress and destroy the Christian religion as well as its scriptures. Jesus' followers often paid a high price, such as being nailed to crosses, being burned alive, or fed to wild animals. Christianity's chances of becoming the dominant global religion were very, very small. I think we can say that on the hypothesis that a given Jewish individual is the promised Messiah, the probability that they would bring members of all nations to worship the God of Israel is roughly equal to 1. Whereas on the hypothesis that Jesus is not the Messiah, the probability is extremely small. The only person to accomplish this feat throughout history is Jesus. Additionally, Israel mostly rejected him, just as predicted by Isaiah, which further decreases the likelihood of this all happening by chance. This gives us good reason to accept both the messiahship of Jesus and the Bible's divine inspiration. Thanks for watching.